All right, let's transport ourselves back in time a bit. Imagine it's the 1890s England. Smallpox is this looming threat, terrifying. But there's this procedure, vaccination, and it can protect you. But, and this is a big but, there might be some, let's just say, unexpected side effects. So that's what we're digging into today. A medical handbook, right, from 1893 called Vaccination Eruptions. And believe me, it's way more relevant now than you might think.
Yeah, it's easy to think, oh, old medical stuff, who cares? But seriously, when we look at the anxieties and debates about vaccination from way back then, over a century ago, it gives us this whole new perspective on what we're dealing with today, with vaccines and everything.
Totally. And what's really cool about this handbook is that it's not just some boring old medical text. It's like, boom, it throws you right into the mix. Public anxiety, heated arguments, even like whispers of misinformation. It was a wild time, right? England had these mandatory vaccination laws because, well, smallpox was a serious threat.
Oh, yeah. And those laws, as you can imagine, they were controversial. I
Hmm.
mean, they were meant to protect people, but, the handbook actually quotes these parliamentary debates where they're going back and forth. Can the government really mandate a medical procedure, even if it saves lives? Sounds familiar, huh?
Oh, absolutely. And it gets even better. The handbook doesn't shy away from the tough questions. Like, it talks about how people were struggling with the risks, right? Even if those risks were tiny compared to getting smallpox, which was devastating. Can you imagine these families just like at the dinner table debating, are a few deaths from the vaccine acceptable if it means thousands more live through an outbreak? Heavy stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And it wasn't just about the life or death stuff either. This handbook shows this deeper fear. Like, people were scared of what these new medical procedures meant for them, for their kids. If their kid got a rash or a fever after a vaccine, was it just a normal thing or was it something worse? It was a real dilemma for people.
And that's where these vaccination eruptions come in, right? I mean, the handbook has this whole section dedicated to them. And wow, it's like a catalog of every skin problem imaginable. Roseola, erythema, eczema, even pemphigus. It makes you wonder if a little scratch seems scarier back then than, an actual disease.
Yeah, it's easy for us to think of a skin rash as no big deal, but back then, medicine wasn't nearly as advanced. Think about it, your child gets a vaccination and develops a strange rash. It's totally understandable that people would freak out a bit.
Absolutely. I mean, they didn't have the same understanding of vaccines that we have today. They couldn't just pull out their phone and Google vaccine side effects and see a nice, reassuring explanation from, like, the CDC.
Right. And that's why this handbook is so fascinating. It's not just some dusty relic of the past. It shows us how people reacted to medical uncertainty. And that's something we still grapple with today, even with all our technology. For instance, they talk about roseola in the handbook, which often appeared after vaccination. Nowadays, we know a common virus causes it, but back then, it was just another mysterious side effect of this new procedure.
It's almost like comparing those roseola fears to some of the things people worry about today with vaccines. I'm not saying it's the same, but you can see some parallels, right? The fear, the unknown.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The details might be different,
Hmm.
but the core emotions, that human fear of the unknown, wanting to protect our children, it's universal. And the handbook really gets into those individual stories, the anxiety people felt. There's this one case, a 5-week-old baby named HS. Really sad, actually.
Oh, yeah, HS. The handbook takes a turn there. It's like a medical mystery suddenly. Dr. Poole, the author, he lays everything out, all the details, the eruptions, inflammation, the whole works. And then he walks us through how he tried to figure out what went wrong.
It's amazing how Dr. Poole approaches this case. He's scientific, obviously, but there's this genuine empathy there, too. You can tell he's invested in helping this child. He throws out all these possibilities. Maybe they misdiagnosed smallpox, or it's some random infection, nothing to do with the vaccination. Remember, this is way before fancy lab tests or anything, so it was a real puzzle.
It really shows you what doctors were up against back then. All they had was observation, deduction, their own gut feeling. And to make matters worse, it wasn't just the HS case that had people on edge. The handbook mentions some wild rumors floating around, people catching tuberculosis from vaccinations, even leprosy.
It sounds crazy now, doesn't it? But even though those fears were totally unfounded, it shows you how scared people were of this new procedure. This is a time when diseases like tuberculosis and leprosy were terrifying mysteries. Nobody understood them, so they were even scarier.
It's like today, right? Some people still get worried about vaccines, even if there's no real evidence to support those fears. Different time, different diseases, but that same fear of the unknown popping up again.
You got it. And just like doctors today try to calm those fears with, actual science and research, Dr. Poole, he takes those wild claims head on. He uses the handbook to explain, like in detail, why it's scientifically impossible to get tuberculosis or leprosy from a vaccination. Pretty cool to see that even back then, they were fighting misinformation with facts.
Makes you think, huh? We've come so far with medicine, but that anxiety, that uncertainty about medical stuff, it seems like it's just part of being human.
Absolutely. And that's why I love digging into these old books, this handbook. It's a reminder that what we're talking about today with vaccines, with how our bodies react to treatment, even the government's role in health, these aren't new conversations. We're still wrestling with the same questions people were asking over 100 years ago.
So we're wrapping up our deep dive into vaccination eruptions. If our listeners take away one thing from all this, what would you want it to be?
That's a good one. I guess I'd say approach these big medical questions with curiosity and, a critical mind. Just like Dr. Poole back in 1893, we've got to ask questions, look for solid information, and be open to talking about it, even when it gets tough.
Couldn't agree more. Our knowledge of medicine has changed so much, but how we react to the unknown, that's still very human. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive today. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and remember, sometimes the past holds some surprisingly relevant lessons for us today.